Something is wrong with the meat. Not spoiled. You would know if it were spoiled, and anyway, it was fresh this morning. Not undercooked. The fire was adequate and the time was right. It is something else, something subtler and more fundamental. The meat is fine. The meat is nutritious and necessary, and you are going to eat it because you need to. But something is missing from it in a way that your tongue registers clearly, even if you do not have the vocabulary or the neurological framework to articulate what that something is. 2 days ago, the group camped near a salt lick, a natural mineral deposit where groundwater has brought dissolved salts to the surface and left them as a residue on the rocks and soil. You watched animals there, not just one or two, many animals, species that did not normally congregate together, standing side by side at the deposit and licking the exposed mineral surface with a focused attention that was distinctly different from grazing or drinking. Something about that specific spot was pulling them in from significant distances. And then someone in your group, out of curiosity or hunger or the same impulse that drives humans to investigate anything that other animals find compelling, touched their tongue to the surface of one of the salt-encrusted rocks. And something happened. Not dramatic, not transformative in an instant, but something. A flavor that was unlike any flavor produced by any food they had eaten. A flavor that the tongue registered not just as pleasant, but as specifically, urgently satisfying, as if the body had been waiting for exactly this input for a long time and was now receiving it with the specific relief that comes from a need being met that you did not fully know you had. This is the beginning of the human relationship with salt. And it is one of the oldest, most consequential, and most underappreciated stories in all of ancient human history. Let's start with the biology, because the biology is what makes the salt story inevitable rather than accidental. Sodium is an essential mineral for human physiology. Not optional. Not beneficial in excess, but survivable without. Essential. The human nervous system cannot function without sodium. It is the primary ion responsible for the electrochemical gradients that allow nerve impulses to propagate, muscles to contract, and the heart to beat. The kidneys cannot properly manage fluid balance without sodium. Cell volume regulation, acid-base balance, the transport of nutrients across cell membranes. All of these critical physiological functions require sodium in specific concentrations. The body manages its sodium levels with extraordinary precision through a set of hormonal feedback systems, primarily the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, that regulate sodium retention in the kidneys and sodium seeking in behavior. When sodium levels drop below the required range, specific mechanisms activate that drive sodium-seeking behavior. These mechanisms are ancient, conserved across vertebrate species, and they produce a specific behavioral state that is, functionally, an appetite for salt. Salt appetite is not a preference. It is a drive state. A physiologically grounded motivation that operates with the same urgency as hunger and thirst when the need is genuine. Animals with salt deficiency actively seek and consume salt deposits in ways that are clearly motivated and clearly distinct from their normal foraging behavior. The congregation of many different species at natural salt licks is one of the most documented and most ecologically significant behaviors in terrestrial vertebrate ecology. Ancient humans were subject to exactly the same physiological imperatives as every other terrestrial vertebrate. Their nervous systems required sodium. Their bodies had the same ancient regulatory systems that produced salt appetite when sodium levels were insufficient. And they lived in a world where natural sodium sources were geographically distributed in ways that made them sometimes abundant and sometimes critically scarce. Let's talk about the natural sodium content of the ancient human diet, because this is the most important context for understanding when and why salt consumption became specifically important. The natural sodium content of different foods varies enormously. Animal blood and organs, the kidney, heart, and liver specifically, are relatively sodium-rich compared to muscle, meat. Fresh seafood contains significant sodium, derived from the marine environment. Plant foods in general are very low in sodium. Freshwater environments provide essentially no dietary sodium beyond trace amounts. For ancient humans living in inland environments with access to game animals and plant foods, the dietary sodium intake was determined almost entirely by the sodium content of the animal products they consumed and by their access to any natural mineral sources. A diet heavy in fresh meat and organs could provide adequate sodium without any additional salt intake. A diet heavy in plant foods, or a diet of dried and preserved meat from which the sodium-rich blood and fluids had been removed, could produce genuine sodium deficiency. This creates a specific pattern in the ancient dietary sodium situation. Populations with consistent access to fresh animal products, blood, and organs in significant quantities had their sodium needs largely met through diet. Populations whose diet was more plant-heavy, or who were in inland environments far from any natural salt source, had greater need for supplemental sodium sources. Populations in coastal environments had access to abundant sodium through seafood and seawater. The ancient sodium story is therefore not uniform. It played out differently in different environments with different urgency at different points in ancient human history. And the specific moments when the need was most acute, when dietary sodium was insufficient for physiological requirements, are the moments when the active seeking of natural salt deposits and eventually the deliberate collection and use of salt as a resource became most important. Let's talk about natural salt sources in the ancient landscape, because ancient humans did not need to manufacture or mine salt to access it. The natural world provided it in multiple forms that were directly accessible. The most dramatic natural salt deposits are the salt licks, areas where mineral-rich groundwater or subsurface salt deposits bring sodium to the surface in concentrations that are detectable and accessible to animals. These sites are found across every continent and represent genuine ecological features with significant wildlife concentrations. Ancient humans moving through landscapes with salt licks were encountering places that were already known to the animal community. Places marked by the convergence of animals from wide areas, the presence of tracks and trails leading to the deposit, and the specific behavioral evidence of focused mineral consumption. The discovery of salt licks by ancient humans was almost certainly made through the same ecological intelligence system that underpinned every other resource discovery in the ancient world: observation of animal behavior as a guide to environmental resources. Animals that ancient humans were tracking, hunting, and observing daily were providing continuous information about the locations of significant resources, and salt licks are precisely the kind of resource that animal behavior would have led ancient humans to discover. Coastal environments provided sodium in the form of seawater and in the salt deposits that form in coastal areas where seawater evaporates. The same process that produces modern sea salt. Ancient coastal populations had effectively unlimited access to dietary sodium through seafood, and the residue salt left by evaporating seawater in tide pools and coastal rock surfaces provided an additional direct source. The specific advantage of coastal environments in terms of sodium access was one of many factors that made coastal habitation particularly attractive for ancient human populations. Mineral springs whose water carries dissolved minerals including sodium chloride from subsurface geological formations are another natural salt source that ancient humans would have identified and used. The specific mineral taste of mineral spring water is immediately detectable to human taste systems. And ancient humans who discovered mineral springs with high sodium content had identified a reliable, renewable sodium source that required no processing or preservation. Now, let's get into the specific evidence for ancient salt use, because the archaeological record provides direct evidence that pushes the documented use of salt significantly further back than most people realize. The oldest confirmed evidence of salt production, the deliberate extraction and processing of salt from natural sources for use and storage, comes from a site in Romania called Lonca, in the Moldova region, where a spring with naturally high salt content has produced archaeological evidence of ancient salt boiling operations dating to approximately 6,000 years ago. This is the oldest confirmed salt production site in Europe, involving the deliberate collection of salt-rich water and its evaporation through controlled heating to produce concentrated salt crystals. But salt production, at 6,000 years ago does not mean salt use began 6,000 years ago. Production, the systematic extraction and storage of salt as a commodity, is a different activity from use, which is simply the consumption of salt from available natural sources. Use almost certainly predates production by a very large margin, and the biological and behavioral evidence suggests that the natural use of salt sources by ancient humans goes back to the earliest period of human existence in salt-accessible environments. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The dietary evidence from ancient skeletal remains is relevant here. Isotopic analysis of ancient human bones can provide information about dietary patterns and specific isotopic signatures associated with high seafood consumption. A high-sodium dietary pattern appear in ancient coastal human populations going back tens of thousands of years. The specific dietary pattern of coastal ancient humans, with its high sodium content, left isotopic signatures in their bones that are directly readable by modern analytical chemistry. The archaeological evidence from salt lick sites associated with ancient human occupation is less definitive but suggestive. Multiple sites across Africa and Eurasia show patterns of ancient human occupation in the vicinity of natural salt deposits, with the specific overlap of ancient human material culture and natural salt source location occurring with a frequency that suggests deliberate site selection rather than coincidence. Let's talk about the taste dimension, because salt's role in food flavor is not simply a cultural preference. It is a neurologically grounded sensory experience that ancient humans encountered whenever they consumed foods with natural sodium content. Human taste perception includes specific receptors on the tongue that detect sodium ions. The salt taste receptors that are part of the 5 primary taste categories: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. These receptors activate when sodium concentration in saliva exceeds a specific threshold, producing the specific sensory experience of saltiness. This activation is generally experienced as pleasant. The hedonic response to saltiness is positive across humans worldwide, except at very high concentrations where it becomes aversive. The positive hedonic response to salt taste is not a cultural construction. It is a physiologically grounded sensory response that motivates sodium-seeking behavior when sodium needs are not fully met by dietary intake. The specific pleasantness of salt on food, the way it enhances other flavors, the way it makes food more satisfying, is a direct consequence of the taste receptor activation and the physiological signals that connect adequate sodium intake to positive hedonic states. Ancient humans eating fresh meat from recently killed animals were consuming food with natural sodium content, blood, organ fluids, and the naturally salty intracellular environment of fresh meat. They were experiencing the salt taste component of that food and the hedonic response it produced. The specific pleasantness of fresh, blood-rich meat compared to dried, blood-poor meat was partly a salt taste comparison. The fresh meat was salted by its own sodium content in a way that the dried meat was not. This means that ancient humans had a baseline reference for what salt-containing food tasted like, derived from fresh animal products, and that the discovery of mineral salt sources would have been recognized as providing something similar to and amplifying what fresh meat naturally contained. The connection between the mineral taste of a salt lick and the taste of fresh meat was not a conceptual leap. Both were activating the same taste receptors and producing the same positive hedonic response. Let's talk about salt and food preservation, because this connection between salt and preservation is one of the most ancient and most consequential applications of salt in human food management, and it almost certainly developed long before any systematic salt production existed. The preservative effect of salt on organic material is a consequence of basic chemistry. Salt creates an osmotic environment hostile to the bacteria and fungi responsible for food spoilage. High salt concentrations draw water out of microbial cells through osmosis, preventing their reproduction and killing many species outright. Food preserved in or coated with salt decays dramatically more slowly than unpacked food under the same conditions. Ancient humans living in coastal environments or near salt licks would have discovered this preservative effect through the same empirical observation process that underpinned all ancient technological knowledge. Meat that fell on or near a salt deposit, or that was exposed to salt-saturated brine, lasted longer before spoiling than meat stored without salt exposure. The connection between salt contact and extended food life was available for observation and would have been made by attentive ancient foragers relatively quickly after consistent access to natural salt sources was established. The implications of salt-preserved food for ancient human life are significant. Meat preservation through drying was already an ancient technology. The reduction of moisture that prevents bacterial growth is the same principle as salt preservation, but achieved through a different mechanism. Salt preservation is more effective than simple drying in humid environments where drying is incomplete, and the combination of partial drying and salt treatment produces preservation times substantially longer than either method alone. For ancient communities that were beginning to manage food storage across seasonal cycles, caching food against lean periods, preserving the surplus from large hunts. Salt-aided preservation represented a significant enhancement of food management capability. The ancient group that understood how to use natural salt deposits to extend the life of preserved meat had a meaningful advantage over groups that did not in the specific form of more reliable food security across periods when fresh food was unavailable. Let's talk about salt and long-distance movement, because the connection between salt access and the geography of ancient human movement is both underappreciated and consequential. The distribution of natural salt deposits in a landscape is geologically determined. It reflects the specific history of evaporate formation, subsurface salt dome geology, mineral spring hydrology, and coastal salt flat formation. This distribution is not uniform, and in some inland environments, natural salt deposits are genuinely scarce over large geographic areas. Ancient human movement through these landscapes was shaped, in part, by the location of salt sources. Communities that had regular access to natural salt in their territory had a genuine resource advantage over those that did not. The periodic migrations to salt sources, the seasonal movements to coastal areas, to mineral springs, to inland salt deposits, represent a class of resource-seeking movement that was as functionally important as seasonal movements toward water sources or prey animal migration routes. The location of salt sources was almost certainly incorporated into the spatial knowledge of ancient communities with the same importance as the location of reliable water sources, reliable food plants, and regular prey animal movement routes. The community's cognitive map of its territory included the salt deposits, and the seasonal calendar of the community's movements included the timing of visits to those deposits. The long-distance exchange networks that ancient communities maintained across neighboring territories served multiple functions, but one function that is underappreciated is the management of resource access across communities in different ecological situations. Communities near salt deposits and communities far from them had differential access to sodium, and the exchange of salt for other valued resources, a form of ancient trade, would have been a rational response to this geographic distribution of a necessary resource. The evidence for ancient trade in salt is primarily from later periods. The salt trade in historical civilizations is extremely well documented and one of the most economically significant commodity trades in human history. But the structural incentives for exchange of salt across communities with differential access are present in the ancient period, and the same long-distance exchange networks that moved obsidian, shells, and pigments across ancient territories almost certainly also moved salt in environments where access was geographically constrained. Let's talk about the relationship between salt and specific ancient health conditions, because the health dimension of salt in the ancient diet is more complex and more interesting than a simple "more is better" narrative. The connection between sodium intake and blood pressure, and between high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, is the primary health concern associated with excessive salt consumption in modern populations. High modern dietary sodium intake, driven by the pervasiveness of added salt in processed foods, is associated with elevated blood pressure in salt-sensitive individuals and contributes to cardiovascular mortality at the population level. This modern health problem is, however, a product of the specific sodium environment of modern food systems rather than a feature of salt itself. The ancient dietary sodium situation was fundamentally different. In environments where dietary sodium was at or below physiological requirements, which describes many inland ancient environments with limited access to animal products and natural salt sources. The health risk was not from excess but from deficiency. Chronic sodium deficiency produces a range of physiological problems including muscle weakness, cognitive impairment, headache, and in severe cases, seizures and death. The regulatory system that manages sodium levels was evolved for an environment where sodium was sometimes scarce, not for the modern environment of abundant processed salt. The salt appetite that this regulatory system produces when sodium is insufficient was a genuinely adaptive physiological drive in ancient contexts. The specific sodium situation of ancient human populations varied dramatically by environment. Coastal populations were essentially never sodium deficient. Inland populations in areas with salt licks or mineral springs had access to supplemental sodium. Inland populations far from any natural salt source, subsisting heavily on plant foods, were the populations most likely to experience genuine sodium deficiency, and the populations for whom access to salt sources had the most immediate health significance. Let's bring all of this together by coming back to where we started. The ancient human at the salt lick, touching their tongue to the mineral surface, and experiencing that specific, urgent satisfaction. They were not discovering a luxury. They were meeting a physiological need that their body had been signaling through the mechanisms of salt appetite for some time before the discovery. The animals that had led them to this place were following the same physiological imperative, expressed through hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution that had built sodium-seeking behavior into the nervous system, because sodium was genuinely essential and sometimes genuinely scarce. The discovery of salt in the ancient world was not a technological achievement in the way that tool-making or fire management was. It was the encounter between a physiologically grounded need and a geologically distributed resource, mediated by the ecological intelligence of a species that was paying attention to the animal world around it as a continuous information system. What came after? The specific knowledge of which deposits were most concentrated, the best seasons to visit specific sources, the use of salt to preserve food, the exchange of salt across communities with differential access, eventually the deliberate collection and processing of salt as a commodity, was the technological and social development built on the foundation of that initial, biologically inevitable encounter between ancient human physiology and the sodium that the landscape made available. The ancient human relationship with salt began with taste, with the specific hedonic response of a sodium-detecting tongue encountering adequate sodium and registering it as what it was, exactly what the body needed. That recognition, immediate, physiological, older than language, is the same recognition that makes the first bite of something properly seasoned taste right in a way that unseasoned food does not. It is not a modern taste preference. It is an ancient physiological signal that has been running in human nervous systems since before our species had a name. We needed salt. We found salt. We have been using it in every possible way ever since.